Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? Hey everybody, my name is Brendan Noble and I'm a young adult author, and today we'll be talking about the romance genre inside the young adult market. First of all, Romeo and Juliet is not a romance. People keep categorizing it as that. I used it as the intro just as a joke, but it is a tragedy. We are talking about contemporary romance, especially today, and contemporary romance and most subgenres under that have to end positively. They're not in a tragedy. Let's get that out of the way and let's get going on this genre. So I kind of put this as the third most popular genre inside YA. It's really close with sci-fi, so that's kind of controversial opinion. They're about equal in terms of the number of sales. A lot more sci-fi books have been written than contemporary romance books inside young adult fiction, so you can choose which one's more popular, but overall neither of them can compete with fantasy. I apologize in some of these stats. Romance is not my category, especially contemporary romance, so I'm not as familiar with a lot of the authors here, but I'm going to do my best to try to give this genre its due justice. So for point number one, 4 of the top authors that I've seen when looking at the top sales for young adult romance and specifically contemporary romance are Gillian Dodd, Jenny Han, Rebel Hart, and Colleen Hoover. Some of those are more specific towards they've had releases more recently, but if you look at the top of the Amazon charts while this is coming out, those will be a lot of the names you see. Point number 2 is that in young adult fiction, most romance books fall under a more subgenre basis for specifically under fantasy, sci-fi, dystopian. We'll talk about that more later, what some of the best and most successful subgenres are inside romance with some of these genre-specific tropes. But while these subgenres and genre-specific tropes within romance have been more successful than contemporary romance itself, contemporary romance has been very successful, and we can't count it out as its own successful subgenre within young adult fiction. Point number 3 on the popularity of the contemporary romance genre in general. It's one of the very successful ones. It's around 1,200 overall if you look at the top 20 books and average them out inside the Kindle store in the romance subgenre. So it's been very popular. And there's about 10,000 books inside of it, which is, again, 5,000 less than sci-fi. So with less books, it's still incredibly successful and selling very well. So contemporary romance is very strong in young adult fiction, but it is not as strong as it is in adult fiction. In adult fiction, romance, contemporary romance, and all those subgenres dominate its sales. They're the top sellers on Amazon, but it's in young adult market, it cannot compete with fantasy, which is an interesting thing to look at between young adult and adult. And there's a lot of differences between those two markets that I won't be going into, but it's something to be aware of if you're writing young adult romance specifically, because it's a completely different audience than you would be writing for adult romance. In terms of book length, contemporary romance books are a lot shorter than fantasy or sci-fi books. They average around 300 pages. They can be significantly shorter than that. They can be a little bit longer, but they do not tend to be on the longer side because a lot of the readers in the romance genre like to have quicker reads and not be reading these epic fantasy style of books. They are much shorter, and they do tend to have longer series, though, with them. So on point number 4, let's talk about some of the hot subgenres within young adult romance. These are some genres that might not necessarily have the most books in them, but are subgenres that are showing success with a potentially small number of books, or a lot of success with a larger number of books. The point of this is to show you some potential subgenres that might be easier to break into for an author, especially a new author that's looking for their place inside of the young adult market. So first, I'd just like to get one of the biggest subgenres that's not contemporary romance, but goes with a fantasy genre, and that's paranormal romance. It's one of the most successful romance subgenres that's not contemporary. It is a very packed field, but is very successful. If you want to hear more about that, you can go check out my fantasy video. I'll link that down in the comments below. Another subgenre that's being very popular right now and still is kind of a more contemporary style romance is clean and wholesome. This is the kind of romance that doesn't have some of the spicy style romance that comes with some of the other books. There's only about 500 books right now in Amazon store within this subgenre, which is not a significant number, but the top 20 of them average about 8,000 overall, which is pretty high for that amount of books. So it shows that there's a lot of readership potential here, and it might be an underserved market. Also worth mentioning is romantic comedy. There's only about 300 books within this subgenre, and it's kind of a newer one, especially in YA. But the top 20 books within it rank about 12,000th overall in the Kindle store, which is not that bad for that small of a number of books. So if you enjoy writing romantic comedy, this could be an area to break into. And for point number 5, let's talk about some of the subgenres that are struggling within the romance category. First up is romance within science fiction and dystopian. So this is, again, another subgenre that's not necessarily contemporary romance specifically, but there's about 1,000 books within the science fiction and dystopian romance section, and overall they rank about, the top 20 rank about 10,000, which is not very high for that number of books, especially in a category you'd expect to be a little hotter than that. I think this is a big category where Hunger Games and especially Divergent fit into. And it's kind of been, again, like I talked about in the science fiction videos with Dystopian, it's a very kind of swamped field, and it's not having as much potential right now. Second is LGBT romance. While LGBTQ books have been much more popular inside of young adult fiction in general, the romance section, there's about 400 to 500 books right now inside this subgenre, but they're only ranking about 45,000th overall with the top 20 books inside the category, which again is fairly low. Even though there's not a ton of books in the category, that's pretty low rank for that high, many books. So while LGBT fiction in general has been pretty successful inside teen and young adult, it's not been as successful inside of romance. And that's all I have for you guys today on the romance genre inside of young adult fiction. On a personal note, my third book, Pridefall, was released this past weekend. It's up there. If you're interested in grabbing a copy of that or getting started on the series, there's some links down in the description where you can get started on the PRISM Files series for free. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe down below. I'll be coming out with new videos every Friday.